I'm Shad, and before we begin, I've just been admiring that all night. That is the coolest thing I have ever seen in a corporate office. I want one. Anyway, so yeah, I work for a data privacy startup called Metomic. I've been working as a designer for about 5 years now, and in that time I've worked as a type, print, blah 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 designer, and now I finally think I'm all right enough at it to give a talk to a room full of designers. So yeah, the context of this talk will largely be around data privacy on the web, baking transparency, and kind of baking friction into your product. So story starts in 2016. In 2016, a design ethicist from Google wrote a blog post that was pretty pivotal. It was pretty important. I'm sure 60% or so of you have read this. And it talks about how big tech is hijacking your mind, and it's taking your attention, it's taking your data, it's siphoning everything from you. But it was very slickly designed to convert traffic to a mobile app that helps you put down your phone. But the cynicism aside, I think we could all agree that we're living in that tech dystopia that we've always wanted. Big tech is hijacking attention, data, so on and so forth. Technology is quite frankly the opposite of calm. So yeah, friction is really, really difficult to design for, and this is one example of many on the wider web, right? I'm not talking about this in the context of any specific product, just in the context of the internet. And as designers, we have a pretty hard job about this, right? VCs, CEOs, product leads all have competing incentive structures, and all of those incentive structures are for conversion and reducing friction. And Silicon Valley has or even tech in general has a bit of fetishism around that word, around that phrase, reducing friction, which I think it shouldn't, because quite frankly, friction is quite useful in a design toolkit just as much as color or type or a good grid system is. So design isn't bad, business incentives are pretty much entirely to blame for this. So yeah, looking at all of you guys and myself. But actually, the silver lining here is that we're also the best equipped in any organization to instigate change in a product. We are the next day, we are the next month, we are the next year in it. So if we're not optimizing for conversion, what should we be optimizing for? And very abstractly, I think my answer to that would be focus. I basically want tech to step in and step out of the way as fast as possible, to not interrupt me too often, and when it does interrupt me, to be very honest about what it's doing, why it's doing those things. So let's examine a real world example, as opposed to thinking about this in the context of technology. So anyone remember Habbo Hotel? It's pretty cool. You're in the queue for a club, right? This is probably tomorrow night. So you're in the queue for a club, and you and your homies are pretty wasted, but you see this sign, and it says, "Smile, you're on camera." Now this is, to me, a kind of interruption. You might not think of it as one. But it has the power to kind of divert your attention briefly, tell you something quite important, and then your attention goes back to being wasted with your friends. This kind of interruption I describe as an informative one. Its job is just to tell you something. It's about awareness. It's not about transacting or so on and so forth. Secondly, so this is the next kind of interruption. So you finally reach the front of the queue, and the bouncer says to you, "No punching people, no snorting lines in the bathroom," and you nod to them, all right? Your consent is already implicit in this context. You've been standing in the queue for an hour, you're really wasted, you want to get wasted. But if you break those rules, there's an implicit consequence to what you do, right? So these, I think, I describe as agreements. So an interruption with an implied repercussion if you break a rule of some description. So that's the second kind. So you finally reach the club, and you're rocking out to Mambo number 5, obviously, and a cast member from The Only Way is Essex walks up to you and is like, "Can I take your photo?" And I'm like, "Well, fine." So that's what I would describe as a transactional interruption. Transactional interruption is essentially something that offers you some choice in anything, in a product. So I kind of prefer to frame this as not an opt-in or opt-out, but as what am I consenting to in this product? So it's more about highlighting the significance of it, framing that as the user is going to make a trade-off, on a personal trade-off, and receive something else. So that's the taxonomy. So I've defined informative, something else, and transactional. So how, when, and where do you use these things? So basically, like these design patterns that I'm going to show you are probably nothing new. I might be preaching to the choir. But I'll talk about this in the context of data privacy because that's what I do day to day. So these examples will probably be applicable to most things. So informative interruptions are obviously the easiest to design for. You basically just put a slug of copy somewhere and you're like, this is what's happening. Cool. And it's the lowest kind of urgency. And urgency is a really important key word here, right? So each one of these interruption types, smartly traffic lighted, increase in urgency. So I think this kind of thing should be attached to any data collection you're doing. And the argument for this kind of stuff is actually very similar to the last talk. It's about building trust with users. It's about making the case that actually with trust and transparency baked into a product, you build positive brand sentiment, and then therefore more money. So again, it's about speaking the language of the business, right? So stakeholders will probably listen to you. So agreements are a little bit more complicated because they require you nodding your head to the bouncer and saying, actually, no, I'm not going to be snorting lines in the bathroom. They require some call to action. And actually, I think this is like one of the worst examples of that. This is, don't do this. Like, absolutely not. Because in this context, the user has not actually understood what the repercussions of breaching that agreement might be. So when you sign up to Twitter, you agree to a massive terms and conditions policy, right? And that terms and condition says, please don't be a Nazi, but as you all know, that is not enforced. Because it's not forefront. It's not something that people are thinking about all the time. So my opinion is that what you're looking at isn't distinct enough from the rest of the content on the page to have salience, right? This is something you just check inadvertently and not think about. And the argument I'm going to make is actually an alternative might be making that interruption a little bit louder. And this some of you are going to cringe at what I've just done. But actually, if a user were to click that button, and I'm not saying have a pop-up in the middle of the screen. I'm saying have a pop-up above that thing, right in the context, so just in time, and say, like, you know, this is what's happening, don't do this. And the affordance of this is actually gives the user some more, like, it feels much more intentional. And the consent is implicit, but now at least the user knows what happens if they fail to comply. So yeah, in the third interruption type, you have consent. Well, what did I describe them as? Transactional, that is correct. Sorry, I've forgotten. I should probably put those titles on there. Transactional interruptions are also best just in time, right? So right after the user implies they were about to do something. Instagram is a really good example of this, right? So actually, mobile designers here, you probably do this really well anyway. So when you open Instagram for the first time on a new phone, you don't get like a billion permissions dialogues thrown at you. You sign up, you get into the product, you see the feed, and you're like, okay, cool, I need some of those like red dopamine notification bubbles. So I'm going to post a photo. And when you hit the post button, then you get the, can we use your photos? Can we have access to your camera? And that's great on mobile, and I think it's really, really well implemented there. But I think this kind of user experience needs to be translated to the web because, of course it does. You're making transactions all the time on the internet. So if a user declines in that kind of context, they simply don't get access to the feature. It works the same on mobile, and it should work the same way on the internet. So that's just like 3 very, very simple design patterns that you could use when designing interruptions. This is something that I think 100% should take over a page. This is something that like is the most urgent kind of interruption you could make. But by giving people, like, by being transparent with your users, I think this is totally justified. And this is exactly the same on mobile. So this final slide is kind of slightly out of context, but basically what I'm going to be talking about here is that in the context of data collection, our products could be a lot more thoughtful. So that basically, to me, sounds like this kind of interruption doesn't necessarily have to be inside a product. So this could be an email or a reminder or some push notification. This could be something that's like very, very like infrequent. But this kind of thing is another one of those like build positive brand sentiment, build transparency into your product, and remind your users that actually you kind of do care about them. Because I think, actually I had this thought earlier today that having users is like a privilege of a product team. It's not like a right. You have to respect their time and attention and their data actually. And I think most people in tech don't do that. And designers, I think, are the best equipped to do that. So we should. So iOS is really, really good at this. So for example, if you're using a mapping application and you background it, and you've backgrounded it for about 30 minutes, but that thing is still sending your location data back to Google, Apple's like, yo, you know, Google Maps is still sending it. Are you cool with this? I'm like, no, obviously not. But yeah, so this kind of sense of sovereignty baked into products is, I think, probably going to become more and more important because the landscape right now is like kind of terrifying, I think. But yeah, so that is basically the gist of my talk. It's very, very short. But yeah, so that's me. Thank you. Follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to beat my housemate.